morning. Let me read to you some ancient words that are timely from Ecclesiastes chapter 4. Again, I observed all the acts of oppression being done under the sun. Look at the tears of those who are oppressed. They have no one to comfort them. Power is with those who oppress them, but they have no one to comfort them. This morning I want to talk to you about something that's both difficult and practical that will help bring our church closer to the fight against injustice, and that is human trafficking. As Matt mentioned yesterday, was International Human Trafficking Awareness Day, a growing issue that is so repugnant that it truly warrants international attention being placed on it. My awareness to this issue grew last year while in Cambodia and Thailand. Both of those countries have a burgeoning sex tourism industry where primarily men from Western countries travel there to take advantage of cheap, plentiful, vulnerable young victims of both genders. The tourist hubs of Chiang Mai in Thailand and Siem Reap in Cambodia, while we were there, I saw over and over again, I saw middle-aged and up Western-looking men out in public holding hands with teen Asians. You'd go to a restaurant and they'd be sitting on their laps. And as a dad and as a human being, I just wanted to punch them right in the face in Jesus' name. That's the truth. I was contemplating maybe doing prison ministry from the inside. My family talked me out of that. It was tempting, though, especially after connecting with some of the ministries and some of the missionaries who are on the front line working to help rescue those who are trafficked, to walk with them through their healing and their restoration, to start to give them skills and training so they can make for themselves a life that isn't in the sex trade, and then to work to try to change the laws to bring justice to the perpetrators. And when you hear about their work, it fills you with this potent mixture of anger and sadness and hope. Hearing their stories were difficult, let alone living one of them. I heard repeatedly stories of rural families that are so poor that they would send their daughters off to the city to work. And of course the daughters would try to find work that would pay enough money to send back to help the family financially, but the work that they would find would be in the sex trade. Now that would be a great shame for their parents to know that, so there exists this kind of don't ask, don't tell relationship between daughters and their parents. And so the daughters are ashamed to ask for help. They increasingly find themselves isolated, and they are in a powerless place of perpetual exploitation, and they become slaves. I talked to a missionary from Germany, a lady who works with trafficked women in Krabi, Thailand, and she said that is like the story that keeps playing out over and over and over again. Young girls from rural villages get sent to the city to try to make money to help their poor families, and this is the work they fall into. Now, I don't need to tell you about the soul damage that is done when your whole identity gets eroded and degraded down to a mere object that gets used and discarded over and over again. Now, what I witnessed was just the tiniest glimpse into a staggering darkness that is growing in our world, a darkness that demands the Church of Jesus Christ to act. Today, there are over 40 million people held in slavery. Now, that's an enormous number, and it's a number that big becomes kind of meaningless. But let me try to put some context to that number. 40 million is more than the population of 158 countries. 40 million is more than all the slaves that were trafficked during the 400 years transatlantic slave trade. That act from our Western culture's history that is so inhumane and evil that is one of the darkest blemishes on the soiled record of humanity. There are more people trafficked now than during the whole slave trade. Human trafficking is the fastest growing criminal enterprise in the world, estimated to generate about $150 billion US. Now, it has numerous expressions. Forced labor, child soldiers, and sexual enslavement being the three most prevalent, but 2/3 of the trafficking revenue comes from commercial sexual exploitation. In India alone, a child goes missing every 12 minutes. 50% of those children are never found. Now, we don't know what happens to them, but all indicators suggest that many of them are trafficked into slave labor, literal slave labor, or into sexual exploitation. Now, you might think, how is this even possible? Like slavery, that's a word from another era, from a less civilized time. How can there possibly be more slaves today trafficked than during the height of the slave trade? Well, let me assure you that even though this isn't my world, this isn't your world, the reality is today that millions of people are trapped, powerless, exploited, abused, and used for somebody else's financial gain. People like Kumar. How about watch his story?
You're working 14, 18-hour days with very little sleep, no freedom. Dignity is taken away from them, and that's something nobody should have to endure. We had a number of years ago, 2 of the bonded laborers escaped from a facility, and they were tracked down by the owners of the facility and brought back, and as a punishment for what they had done, their hands were chopped off.
We would go to the government officers and we'd say, sir, there is a bonded labor case. And almost always the response was, there is no bonded labor in my area. What are you talking?
How much? 30?
Yeah, my friend.
Ruchira, there's a girl who's very afraid, almost unable to walk.
This is Kumar. He was abandoned by his mother, and his father was suddenly killed. Orphaned and alone, he was accountable for his parents' debts. And at just 7 years old, he was forced into slavery.
வேலை செய்யும் போது ஒரு நாள் சார் ரொம்ப கையெல்லாம் ரொம்ப வெளியே எடுத்துக்கிச்சு சார் ரொம்ப எரியிற மாதிரி ரொம்ப கொள்ளு தூக்க கூட ஆகமாயிருச்சு சார்.
Kumar remembers a day where he was so ill he couldn't get out of bed. Immediately, his owner came looking for him.
அவங்க வந்து ஏன்டா வேலைக்கு போகலான்னு கேட்டாங்க. நான் சார் உடம்பு சரியில்லைன்னு சொன்னேன். அப்புறம் அவங்க வந்து கூட்டிட்டு போனாங்க, ரூமுக்கு கூட்டு போனாங்க. அப்புறம் சூக்காலே வச்சுட்டாங்க.
ಗೊತ್ತು ಅವನ್ನೆಲ್ಲ ಇವತ್ತು ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿ ಎಲ್ಲ ಒದಗಿ ತಿಂದಿರೋದು ಎಲ್ಲರೂ ತಿಂದಿರೋದು ಅದನ್ನಿಂಕ
வேற நம்ம அப்பா அம்மா இருந்தால் நம்மளுக்கு நல்லா இருக்கும் அப்படின்னு நினச்சேன் சார்.
Kumar was trapped by debt and a slave owner who beat him continuously. He, like so many, had no remaining hope for a way out.
It's hard to imagine being 7 years old. And every bit of love and security you've known is gone. And you find yourself alone, abandoned, and all you know now is servitude and beatings. In fact, you don't even know that you're a slave because this is all that you've known. This is your whole experience. Now, this story, Kumar's story, was one of many that I could share. In fact, it was the most G-rated one I could find, which is why I took it. And I wish his story was a rare exception. I wish it was plucked out of obscurity, but it isn't. 1 in 4 slaves is a child. The average age that somebody is trafficked is 12. Think of that. 40 million men, women, and children created in the image of God, endowed with dignity and worth, loved by God, reduced down to an object, a thing. So what do we do with this information? How do you begin to even process an evil of this scope? And maybe the question is, what does God think about this? And where is God in the midst of all of this? The scripture that we read this morning in our worship time from Luke chapter 4 is when Jesus is in his hometown synagogue. It's like his home church that he grew up in, and he knows them and they know him. And he gets to do the scripture reading that day, and he reads from the prophet Isaiah, who describes the coming Messiah's passions and the coming Messiah's ministry. And Jesus reads these words: "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he's anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom to captives, recovery of sight to the blind, and to set free the oppressed, and proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And then Jesus says, those words that I just read to you that Isaiah wrote, those are about me. This is who I am. This is why I've come. This is why I was born. That Jesus was sent by the Father to bring good news to the vulnerable, to the poor, to set prisoners free, to bring freedom to the oppressed. Jesus cares about people enslaved. And because some of Jesus' followers also care, Kumar is no longer a slave. Watch this.
IJM discovered the horrific conditions in the brick factory where Kumar and others were being forced to work against their will.
ಕಾಸಿಲ್ಲ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ನಾನು ಹಂಗೆ ಇದ್ರೆ ಕೆಲಸನೂ ಮಾಡೋಲ್ಲ ಏನು ಪಚ್ಚಾಗೆ ಎತ್ತಾಕಂಬಂದು ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಬೆಂಡ್ ಎತ್ಬಿಟ್ರೆ ಆಮೇಲೆ ಮತ್ತೆ ನಾನು ಫ್ಯಾಕ್ಟ್ರಿ ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಹೋಗೋದು.
And, based on their undercover video evidence, local government authorities and police came alongside IJM to conduct a rescue operation.
The more and more we are doing these rescues, people are getting aware that people are being abused. There is bonded labor, there is trafficking. Also, the law is going to take its course as well as perpetrators go behind.
When the team arrived in the morning and entered the brick factory, 15 men, women, and children were rescued and given their freedom back. Then, they were each given a certificate to prove that they no longer owe any debts to their former owner. And one was for Kumar.
After being rescued, IJM placed Kumar in their aftercare program to heal.
You'd ask him a question anytime, no matter what, and he would say, the one thing I want to do, sir, is I want to study. He was clear about that.
And then, they enrolled him in school for the first time. Today, he is studying to be a social worker, to help those still suffering like he did.
இதை காட்டியிருந்தோன்னா அவர் உண்மையாகவே சந்தோஷப்பட்டிருப்பார். நம்ம அவர் அன்பாக இருந்தும் நான் இந்த அளவுக்கு இதை காட்டியிருந்தேன்னா.
And what we do at IJM is we go look for that lost sheep, that girl that's being abused, that widow who's been run out of her home. And we will search for her until we find her. That's how our Father has loved us. That's how we are called to love others. Not to search for them until we've satisfied ourselves. Not to search for them until it gets really hard. But to go after them until we find them, to be relentless in our love.
Kumar is now a college student who is thriving in life because Jesus followers at the International Justice Mission, which is an organization consisting of over 700 lawyers, pastors, missionaries, trauma social workers, who are working at 19 different places around the globe with 4 big priorities. They're going to bring convictions to traffickers. They're going to rescue those who are trafficked. They're going to rehabilitate those who are trafficked. And then they're going to work with local government to change laws or to enforce laws so that the most vulnerable are protected. Kumar is one of just 49,000 slaves that the International Justice Mission has rescued so far. The other great news is that Kumar is also now a Jesus follower. His physical freedom became a vital stepping stone in his redemptive path to experience spiritual freedom in Jesus. There is freedom from oppression because of the work of God's people following in the footsteps and the priorities of Jesus. Now, trafficking is a massive problem in some places of the world, but you need to hear that there is nowhere where it is not a problem. I know that's a double negative, but I think it makes sense. There's nowhere where it's not a problem, including here in Canada. Through the Freedom Climb Canada, which was started by a number of mountainsiders, we have learned the scale of trafficking and exploitation that happens right here in our own country. Some of you have met ladies who were rescued out of trafficking here in BC and in Alberta, and so I don't need to convince you that this is a growing issue here at home. I regularly either hear another story or read something on CBC or in the news article that shatters this illusion that trafficking is just an over there issue. It's not just another part of the world problem. But while the languages and locations vary, there is one common factor that unites all of those who are trafficked, and it's this. It's vulnerability. Vulnerability is the key ingredient that leads to trafficking. Poverty is a huge motivating factor that forces the vulnerable into exploitation to try to survive. We've heard stories of poverty driving some parents to quote-unquote sell their children to traffickers. Their situation so desperate they feel like this is their only option. A horrific decision out of a horrific situation. Orphans are especially vulnerable for obvious reasons. But vulnerability can express itself in a lot of different ways. A lonely, bored teenager from a small middle-class town like Fernie who connects with somebody online who has an exciting offer for them where they might make lots of money could be a picture of vulnerability. A single mom so desperate for shelter that she trades a dry place to stay for her services is a story we see over and over again in El Salvador. Immigrants brought to Canada under false pretenses only to find their passports get taken away by their sponsor and the job that they were promised never materialized. They're in a foreign country where they don't speak the language. You can easily see how they could become targets for exploitation. Runaway children make up the largest portion of the exploited in North America. And here's a stat that is just so horrific, but it's true, that the average age a teen enters the sex trade in the United States is 12 to 14 years old. Most of them are runaways who have experienced sexual abuse sometimes in their story. But vulnerability in any expression places people on a collision course with human traffickers. And so any ministry that decreases vulnerability is helping combat injustice and oppression in our world and decrease trafficking. And Mountainside, you have a strong record of helping the most vulnerable. This year we're going to be building 24 more homes in El Salvador. In a month we're going to be building 24 more homes in El Salvador. That's over $80,000 that were raised. A lot of it coming from some of you right here. That's 24 families that in 1 month's time will be less vulnerable than they are now. Freedom Climb Canada, which was started by some ladies out of this church, raised $250,000 for projects through OM, Operation Mobilisation, that help women and children who are trafficked and vulnerable. Fernie Friends of Refugees, also started by people out of this church, has relocated 15 refugees and it got them established in Canada. We as a church, we support children's homes in Kenya and Uganda, where we send money and some of our people there to help kids have a place to live and a place to learn where they can grow up and they can define and decide their own future for themselves. Our church is one of the largest per capita in Western Canada sponsors of Compassion Canada. I mean, we have like more kids sponsored per capita than most churches in Western Canada. Thanks to the hard work of Sylvia and your sponsorship, scores of vulnerable children have a hope-filled tomorrow. And when you send out your check every month or it gets deducted from your visa, your dollars aren't just opening doors to a brighter future, it's closing doors to exploitation. And so I'm proud of what you as a church have done and what you are doing. But there's more work to be done. We're going to hear from Ramona in a couple minutes, share a bit about her story and about how God has intersected her life with this issue and how that's grown into a ministry where she is taking the work of Jesus to bring good news to the poor and freedom to the oppressed. But let me highlight a couple meaning four. I don't know. Let me highlight a couple of couples of practical things that you can do today, that you can consider today, that would actually help in this whole catastrophe of human trafficking. First thing, parents, teach your kids internet safety. Monitor their devices. I know if you got a teen, they're not going to want you to look at their phone, but here's the deal. If they live in your house and you pay the phone bill, it's your phone. So you have the right to look at it. It's one of the most loving things you can do, because the internet is increasingly used by traffickers to see as a safe and easy inroad, not safe, an easy inroad into the lives of teens. And here's the deal. Traffickers, they don't look like, a slimy thug from a Liam Neeson movie. That's not how they come across. They look for vulnerability where they can exploit, and they try to build trust. And then in time, they'll use that for their advantage. So parents, have a conversations about smart internet practices. Know who your kids are chatting with. Second thing you can do. Deal with your porn problem. The engine that drives so much sexual exploitation is pornography. Too many people think that porn is this victimless crime that's just mean and device and it doesn't hurt anybody, but that's a lie. It degrades your humanity. It degrades the person on the screen's humanity. And this porn obsession in our culture, it is what fuels so much of the exploitation of women and children. And so for God's sake and for yours, get help from me. We know it's a powerful addiction. We know it consumes and controls lives. We know that most people in it, they hate it. But get help. There's help for you in this church. We'd love to talk with you to help you bring freedom. But please stop minimizing it or thinking it's not a big deal, because that's a lie. Third thing, consider foster parenting. You can have a life-on-life impact to a vulnerable kid right here in our valley. You can talk to Matt and Megan, who have gone on this journey. Talk to Megan. Not Matt, maybe. I'm just kidding. Matt's also a champion in it. Megan is definitely a bigger champion about it. But you can talk to Matt or Megan or Helena, who is starting to come to our church. She's not here this morning. I don't see her. But she works for the ministry and she oversees foster care in our valley. And she would love to connect vulnerable kids with loving homes. And we got lots of loving homes in this church. You might consider that. Fourthly, would you consider giving some of your time or your money to one of these trusted organizations that are making a difference? We got 2 local and 2 international. International Justice Mission, that's the organization about Kumar. This is all they do. This is all they do is they work to end human trafficking. OM, Operation Mobilisation Canada, which is the umbrella organization of the Freedom Climb. sponsor a number of projects in India, in the Philippines, I believe, that are looking to free those who are in exploitation and help change their lives. Two other organizations close at home, Recovery House, which is at reallifeteam.ca, which is not in Okotoks, it's in High River. Is that right, High River? It's in High River, Alberta. It's a home that for women who are rescued out of sexual exploitation and have been trafficked here in Canada for them to recover. I mean, it's just over there. Joy Smith Society. Joy Smith was a member of Parliament who saw just how growing trafficking was, and was so frustrated that there was very little movement in laws to start to really push in on perpetrators and exploiters of children. And so she's done a lot of work to change kind of change the political will around the gravity of this issues, and also to support a number of projects. Those are four ministries that we would wholeheartedly say you can trust to put your donations toward. So I heard there was a big tech bonus here in this last quarter, so you might consider sending some of your profits, extra tech profits, their way, and we would think that would be a good thing. Lastly, is that Ramona just answered an email, and it opened a door for her to ministry. And so if this starts stirring something in your heart, we'd love to enter into a conversation with you to see how can we come alongside and help you make a difference in this issue. Because when I think back about how slavery in America went unchecked for hundreds of years, when I read stories like Amistad or 7 Years a Slave, I get filled with such indignation and anger that so many people chose to ignore and dismiss this great evil that was right in front of them. Many of those were churchgoers. Here's what I believe. I believe that there never would have been slavery in America if the Church of Jesus Christ stood up and took it as seriously as Jesus does. The church in America was powerful enough, was influential enough that it could have been stopped if believers said, this is not okay. That we are going to answer Solomon's query from Ecclesiastes chapter 4, that who is going to comfort the oppressed? Who is going to bring power to the oppressed? We are going to take Jesus' words that his good news is for the poor and the vulnerable, that he meant to set people free. We're going to take that seriously. And if the church would have done that, slavery wouldn't have been such a blight on Western culture's history. But they didn't for a long time. But the church gets another shot at it today. That we, like them, are called by Jesus to preach good news to the poor and the vulnerable, to bring freedom in his name to the oppressed. And if we do that, there is enough resources in the Church of Jesus Christ that the slave trade, that human trafficking could be eliminated in a decade. It really, really could be. If more of us follow the example of Jesus